It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert here on 93.9 The Ville. This is the show about all things University of Louisville. We talk about research, we talk about things going on in the news, we talk to faculty, staff members, students. So I hope you'll stick around for the next half hour or so. You might learn something. So what do we got in the second half of the show? Why is there a racial gap in the number of cervical cancer deaths? A U of L researcher has some, but not all of those answers. But first, you've heard the old wives' tale that you'll catch a flu if you stay out in the cold too long. Well, it turns out that may not be so much of an old wives' tale, at least not entirely. Dr. Forrest Arnold is with the University of Louisville Physicians, ULP. He also teaches classes about infectious diseases at the U of L Medical School, and he's here to talk about colds and flu. Great subjects there, Dr. Arnold.
That is my career.
That is your career, colds and flu, huh? Well, we're in March, and is this not the peak flu season?
It is. I think a lot of people think the peak flu season is the dead of winter at the turn of the year, but in Kentucky, it's towards the end of March, and even last year, it was the first week of April we peaked out with flu.
Why is that? Why isn't it in the middle of December and January when it's really cold outside? Why is it in March or perhaps April?
I think because we're a little farther south, so as the farther north you go, the peak is a little earlier. But we're just enough south that if for whatever reason it peaks at the end of March here.
Okay. And what percentage of people in Kentucky, do you have any idea how many people get vaccines and how many don't, or across the United States? Because I always get my flu vaccine, but there's a lot of people who don't.
Right. I did look that up right before I came, and it's 4 out of 11 people got the vaccine. So it's kind of a weird number.
So 36%.
Yeah,
see, about a third. So I'm math pretty good on that?
Yeah, very good.
So only 36% of people get the flu vaccine.
Right, that are eligible for it. And all you need to do to be eligible is basically be over 6 months of age. So it's a lot of people that should be getting the vaccine.
But they're not. So as a doctor, how do you convince them to get it? Or are you trying to convince them to get the vaccine?
No, I convince them. If they're in my office and they're telling me they haven't had the flu shot, then I do try to convince them. I hear a lot of the same reasons that I'm allergic to eggs, which they've done away with that one. Or every time I get it, I get the flu. So the flu vaccine is dead, and what it's supposed to do is wake up your immune system. And so that inflammatory response kind of gives you some symptoms like you might have the flu, but it's certainly not the flu, and it goes away in a day. In fact, I tell my patients, if that happens, then that's a good thing. That means your immune system is working. That's what it's supposed to do. Mm-hmm. I've had it before, but I certainly don't have it every year.
Right. So you've had it before when you got a flu shot.
Right. I've had the symptoms, like, I'm got a little headache, I'm kind of weak or whatever, and then it goes away in a day, and I'm like, hey, I'm glad my immune system is working.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about this research here in a few minutes that shows that when you actually get the flu, more likely to get the flu, because I thought that was interesting. But let's stay on this topic for a second here. So you said the flu vaccine is dead. It's made out of eggs, right, or something? Or what? Describe the flu vaccine to me, and what do you mean when you say it's dead?
Oh, okay. They use virus in it that is influenza, and that flu virus is dead. Unless you get the nasal... So it's not
an active virus. They're not injecting you with an active virus when they give you the flu vaccine.
Unless you get the nasal mist, which the CDC said not to get this year.
Oh, really?
So the nasal mist is a live vaccine.
Okay.
But the shot that most everybody gets is a dead virus. That's right.
Okay. And then this year, I know last year in 2016, the flu vaccine was good for against like 60% of the people that got flu, right, or the types of strains of flu.
This year, like 2016-17, it's about 50 to 60%. Last year, they didn't guess so well which strains, so it was more like 20%.
And when you said they didn't guess the strains, I've read this story. It is amazing because it's 2 or 3 years out that they have to figure out they have to guess what's going to be the strain of the flu that hits in 2000, like this year, in 2019 or 2018. They're trying to guess what the strain is.
Yeah, they try to guess what it's going to mutate to. And being in the northern hemisphere helps a little because it hits the southern hemisphere first, but it's still not enough time to make a gazillion number of flu vaccines. And so they get a little help being in the northern hemisphere, But you're right. They're trying to predict a couple years ahead of time what it's going to mutate to, and that's a very hard job.
So how do you convince your patients then, if it's only 60% effective or 50% effective against the flu, I got a 50-50 shot that I might wind up with the flu anyways. Why should I get the shot?
Right. And so, for those people that get the flu, it's 100%. So if it keeps you from getting the flu, we always remember that approximately 30,000 people die every year from the flu. Why should it be you? Certainly it's the people who already have comorbidities and the like. But if you have the flu, you're out of business for 3 days or so. And if I could have that time back, I certainly would want it back. Sometimes people, they'll be at work or maybe they're at a dinner party and they're like, I'm trying to enjoy myself, but I have the flu. That's not the flu. Yeah, it's a cold.
That's a cold, and you're feeling like crap.
The flu is like, I want to go to bed, no questions asked. That's where I'm going. My body's just like down.
There's a difference, right? All right, we're talking with Dr. Forrest Arnold from ULP, University of Louisville Physicians, and he also teaches at the medical school. Well, let's talk about when you are most likely to get the flu. I think this study will startle some people, but go ahead and give us some details of the study that just came out.
Well, this study looked at to see if there was an association between temperature and getting the flu. And so they looked to see if every year, if the flu season epidemic starts with a cold snap, if you will. And they had about 20,000 people, so a lot of data. And what they noticed was that influenza was indeed associated with a lower temperature that hits an area. So they also looked at some other things. They looked at viruses, perhaps that a lot of listeners have not heard of, that cause the common cold, like Boca virus and metapneumovirus. But they also looked to see if it was associated with humidity, which it was not. And they looked to see if it was associated with something called vapor pressure, which is an indication of the how fast a liquid evaporates. So I can't tell you the difference, because it seems to me if it's humid outside, that liquid's not going to evaporate very fast, and if it's dry,
it's going to stay in the air. Yeah.
So they seem very equivalent to me. So I have to have another guest to explain the difference between vapor pressure and humidity.
We need somebody from the Speed School of Engineering or something, or some weathercaster that can figure that one out.
I do understand temperature, though.
Yes.
And so what they're looking at is to see if the epidemic starts. So they didn't look to see if, I forgot my computer in the car, I'm going to run outside and get it. It's only 25 degrees. Am I going to get the flu if I go out there and get it? They didn't have 20,000 people that ran outside in the cold and came back, which is kind of what we would want to know and what our old wives' tale tells us.
Right.
But they did see that when that snap started, that's when the influenza season hit. I think one thing to remember is that we have influenza cases all year long. There's just a major peak in the winter.
Right.
And so that's another thing to keep in mind.
Well, the thing that I found interesting about the study when I was reading it, I thought this was an old wives' tale, that just because the temperature drops and it's cold outside has absolutely nothing to do with the flu. It's just a transmission between me and you. I sneeze on you, you get the flu, just like I have it. That it had nothing to do with the temperature. But when it's cold outside, the air is dry. This study concluded that it's more likely that those particles from my sneeze will stay in the air longer and hit and perhaps infect more people, right? Isn't that the deal?
Exactly. Because influenza is not like tuberculosis where your TB will float down the hallway. It'll just be in the air, and on these droplets it falls. And so if you're close enough to somebody, maybe 3 feet, you'll catch it. But if the air's drier, maybe 6 feet is all the closer you need to be to catch the influenza. If we could see influenza, you would see that people leave a wake behind them with all these droplets. It's falling on everything around them, and then they're coating doorknobs and who knows what else. When it's cold outside, I think of, everybody gets together inside, and then you've got more transmission that way of the people that actually have it.
So other than washing your hands repeatedly, which everybody talks about, what are ways that you can avoid getting the vaccination, obviously? What are some ways you can avoid getting the flu, other than those two obvious things?
Right. Well, some people avoid crowds. I know that if they're afraid of being getting the influenza, that they just stay away from crowds. But if you are in a crowd, you could consciously not touch your face, because it's your hands that get contaminated a lot of times touching stuff. And so if you could just consciously not put your fingers in your mouth, your eyes, kids are terrible at this, and adults, we do it occasionally, and then sometimes that's all it takes.
Okay. Or wash your hands before you eat lunch. Sometimes I don't do that when I go to eat my lunch, and I may be shaking hands with God knows how many people during the day,
or scratch your eyeball or whatever.
Yeah,
that's
right. I got you. All right. Well, let's talk about colds now. Again, we're talking with Dr. Forrest Arnold from U of L Physicians, ULP. Colds. What causes a cold? Just tell me the simplest biological explanation of what causes a cold.
Okay. That is a virus, and it takes residence usually in your nasopharynx and does its thing, which is to infect that area, and it stimulates your immune system, and just multiplies.
Okay. And do those little pills, those lozenges, the vitamin C, if I pound my body with vitamin C when I think I might be getting a cold, does that really work, or is that an old wives' tale too?
Well, they've done studies, and the vitamin C doesn't hold up.
So don't bother with it.
Yeah, the vitamin C is not a great thing to get rid of a cold. I think everybody should realize it's not a bacteria. So there's a lot of really just symptomatic things that we do to help, but not a whole lot of therapeutic things.
All right. So
once you've got it.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. Is there anything you can do once you get a cold? Because I just don't know really anything other than keep blowing your nose and taking cold medicine to keep the runny nose from getting really bad.
Right. There's sometimes the postnasal drip turns into a sinusitis, so if you help take medicines to prevent that, you'll prevent another infection on top of it. But to actually get rid of the influenza, not really. Maybe salt water, gargling with salt water, as actually therapeutic against it. That'd probably be the closest thing.
Well, you've probably seen a lot of this, and I just have some anecdotal evidence of this, that it seems like a lot of people who got colds or coughs this year wound up with some sort of respiratory problem that they had for 3-4 weeks. I heard people in my office just coughing, or seems incessantly, for a month. Is that a common occurrence, or is that something that is a cold morphing into something else like bronchitis?
No, it's a cold. Cold means that you have one of these viruses, and there's just hundreds and hundreds of different ones. So perhaps those people that got the cough really got metapneumovirus or adenovirus, and it worked its way down, whereas other viruses like rhinovirus really just kind of stay up in your head. So it kind of depends on which kind. Those are not tests that doctors can do and just order the test. They're really just research to find out which virus exactly that you have. So it's nothing that you'll ever know, and it's kind of a frustrating thing.
All right. So as a doctor, what tips would you give to our listeners here in March as they walk around in the middle of flu season? What would you tell them? What are the 3 main tips you'd give them right now for flu and cold season?
It is not too late for the flu vaccine. As much as the drugstores want to sell you one in August, you probably should wait more to October, November to get your flu shot. But right now is not too late. Certainly wash your hands, go into the crowds, and don't pick your nose. Okay.
Well, good advice. I won't pick my nose today. How about that? It'll be the first day in a long time I haven't picked my nose, but just kidding. All right, Doctor, I appreciate you coming on the show, Dr. Arnold. Thanks so much. And now I've learned something. See, I've learned a lot about colds and flu.
Fantastic.
How to handle them. All right, very good. Dr. Erin Medlin is a doctor with U of L Physicians and a teacher in gynecologic oncology in the U of L School of Medicine, and we're going to talk about cervical cancer.
It's very good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Good to be here.
Dr. Medlin. So what do you teach? You teach gynecologic oncology.
Exactly.
For those of us who aren't smart enough, what does that mean? What is that?
So I specialized in obstetrics and gynecology into gynecologic oncology and focus on women's cancers, specifically cancers of the female genital tract. So vulvar cancer, vaginal cancer, cervical cancer, uterine cancer, and ovarian cancer.
So you train the future medical students that want to go into cancer, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, we're glad you're here. Well, let's talk about cervical cancer.
Let's do it.
What's the disparity? We were going to talk about the disparity among cervical cancer in different women. So why don't you go into what the studies and research have shown?
Yeah, so there was a recent study that was published out of Johns Hopkins University that looked at health disparities and mortality in cervical cancer, meaning the death rate in cervical cancer. What the previous studies had neglected to do is account for hysterectomies. So when we look at women who've had a hysterectomy, obviously don't have a uterus or cervix anymore, and those women are no longer at risk for cervical cancer. And the previously calculated rates of mortality and incidence, they had included those women in there. So when they adjusted for that, they were able to see some greater disparities among Black and white women, specifically in the older population, especially those over the age of 85, and even over those over the age of 65. So we're seeing mortality rates in women who are Black as opposed to white about almost twice that in Black women than in white women.
Wow. Well, how many women in America die of cervical cancer each year? Any idea?
About 12,000 a year are diagnosed, and the mortality rate is much lower. I couldn't quote you a number right now, but it's not high, and the reason for that is that we do have effective screening programs that have lowered the rate of mortality in the United States over the last 30 years, really, since Pap smear screening came into effect in the late 70s.
Right.
We are seeing a decline, but we still have kind of leveled out over the last 5 years. The reason for that is women who die of cervical cancer are those who are not getting screened, have not been screened in the last 5 to 10 years, or who have never been screened.
So let's ask the obvious question. Why are Black women dying more from cervical cancer than white women?
You know, there's a lot of speculation for that. You don't see those disparities in the younger population. It may be tumor biology. Black women may have more aggressive histologies. It may be that Black women are not being offered as aggressive treatment as white women. That has been shown in some of the literature. It could be access to care and access to affordable health care. All of those are probably playing a factor into the disparities that we're seeing, but nothing has really shook out as a one cause for that.
Are we seeing that in Louisville? Is it any different than any other city in the
Louisville
U.S.?
is probably more so than in other
really?
cities. And the reason for that is cervix cancer is extremely high in the state of Kentucky, one of the highest incidents in the country. We have low access to care, so that is part of the problem. Socioeconomic factors play into that. And we have a disparity between Blacks and whites here, and I would anticipate that is seen in cervix cancer as well.
And so just the access to care, is that the main reason that Kentuckians have a higher rate of cervical cancer?
There's probably that. Smoking plays a big part into the pathogens.
How does smoking play into cervical cancer?
Cervical cancer is caused by a virus, HPV, the vast majority of cervix cancer. Right. Smoking diminishes your ability to fight viral infections. HPV is no stranger to that. So while that immune system is going down, cervical cancer is allowed to rear its ugly head, and we see more in smoking populations. And unfortunately, the state of Kentucky has a high prevalence of smoking. So
our bad habits as Kentuckians are leading to more cervical cancer than the rest of the country. Vaccinations, the HPV vaccine, there's been a lot of controversy about it. And I read an article, I think it was in Time magazine not too long ago, that said that the rates of young women getting the HPV vaccine was far lower than anybody anticipated. Why is that, and what do you recommend?
The reason for that, so yes, it is absolutely correct that the rates of vaccination are much lower in the United States and in a lot of other industrialized countries. Only about 30% of young girls and boys will complete the 3-shot series. About 50 to 60% of boys and girls will start the series, but only 30% complete the series. There are a lot of reasons that are playing into that. One is that initially, when it was marketed, it was kind of put off as HPV as a sexually transmitted disease, which it is, but it wasn't marketed as an anti-cancer vaccine. And that has played into some prejudices we have about sexual activity in young girls and young boys. People had a theory that it would promote sexual promiscuity among teens. That has not shown to be true, but that still kind of plays into people not recommending it. We're also not seeing providers recommend it as much as other vaccines. So although providers are aware that there's a link between HPV or HPV virus and cervix cancer, as well as anogenital cancers and neurooropharyngeal cancers, only about 20% of providers are recommending it routinely. So it goes both ways. Both people are not seeking it out or have reasons that they don't want to get it, and providers are not recommending as much as we should.
Right. We're talking to Dr. Erin Medlin, who's a doctor with UofL Physicians and a teacher in gynecologic oncology in the UofL School of Medicine. And we're talking about cervical cancer. On that vaccine, it's the first vaccine that stops cancer, right?
Yeah.
And so, you'd think that most people around the world are thinking, holy cow, well, we ought to get that vaccine.
Absolutely.
But there's been some pushback, and even I think a former or current U of L faculty member has said that, in her opinion, it causes more harm, potentially more harm than good. So what do you, as a physician, what do you tell the parents who come in and say, you know what, I've heard mixed reviews on this. I'm not sure what to do. My 14-year-old daughter, we think we ought to get her the shot, but we're not so sure about it. So what do you tell them? So
I tell these patients that it is a vaccine that prevents cancer. The majority of teens and even adults will clear the HPV virus. 70% of people will clear the HPV virus, but that ability dwindles as we age. You are likely to reacquire HPV later on in life. It is ubiquitous in our environment, and so you're likely to acquire it and could go on to develop cervical cancer. The studies that have been done with the HPV vaccine have given about 60 million injections. The risk of adverse effects is extremely low. A lot of the adverse events that we've seen in the media, some girls who have fainted or had a lot of these issues, have shown not to be related to the vaccine and caused a lot of smoke where there was no fire.
Right.
So as a healthcare provider for women, I absolutely recommend it. As a provider who takes care of young women who have cervix cancer who may die of this disease, I absolutely recommend the HPV vaccine.
All right. And if I get cervical cancer, well, I'm not going to get cervical cancer,
yes,
but you might. What are the odds that I can beat it? You said that the death rate was pretty low, but so are the odds, assuming I can get treatment early, are they pretty good that I'm going to live?
The odds that you will live are extremely good. Most cervical cancer in this country, because of screening, is caught early, and their chances of survival are close to 90%, even higher for early stage disease. And even advanced stage disease, it can be cured. We recommend that women get screening at appropriate intervals. Those intervals are different based on your age group, but that can help to catch cancer early or to prevent early lesions from becoming cancer.
And what are the things that women should look for that might lead them to believe they perhaps have cervical cancer, or do you just not know?
So there are some symptoms that can kind of heighten your awareness to maybe you have cervical cancer. If you're having bleeding after intercourse or abnormal spotting in between periods, that can be a sign of cervical cancer. Abnormal discharge, that's different for you. Those are really kind of the big things that may heighten you to cervix cancer, and really just making sure that you're seeing your doctor every year and reporting those complaints or concerns and making sure you're getting a pelvic exam when you need it.
How often should women get pap smears?
So it depends on the age. For women under the age of 21, pap smears are not recommended. From the age of 20.
Why not? What's
the reason
deal?
being is because most young girls will clear the HPV virus. We used to pap people at the age of 18 or 3 years after they started intercourse, and we were doing a lot of procedures on cervixes that didn't need to be done that could have consequences later on in life from over-treatment. So now we have loosened some of those guidelines and start pap smears at the age of 21. Those should be done every 3 years up until the age of 29. At the age of 30 to 65, women should get pap smears with HPV testing every 5 years or a pap smear alone every 3 years.
So more testing after age 30? Is that right?
Less testing after age 30. Every 5 years if you're getting
Okay.
the pap test with the HPV test.
Okay.
There's also recently, I think we'll see a shift in our society that will go a lot towards HPV testing. So an HPV alone test was approved for women over the age of 25 as the primary form of screening.
And what percentage of women out there in the United States are actually going every 3 years to get the pap
You know,
smears?
it's actually a lot of women do go every 3 years.
Really?
Or every.
I suspected the percentage was pretty
yeah,
low. But
so a lot of people do get screened, and the Affordable Care Act and other kind of health expansions have allowed for preventative care to be covered. For women who have cervix cancer, the majority of them are not screened within the last 5 years. So that is what we are seeing, kind of the after effects of not being screened, is that you have those are the women that go on to develop cervical cancer.
We're talking with Dr. Erin Medlin from the University of Louisville. I saw something and heard something about vinegar being used to combat cervical cancer. Explain how that works.
So for women, it's mostly done in the third world or developing countries that at the time, instead of doing a pap smear where you have to get samples of cells, they have to be read by a pathologist, and you have to then get those results back. For women who have live far and wide in Africa and other countries that don't have easy access to care, what they're doing is having them come in. They apply acetic acid or vinegar to the cervix, and they're able to see changes on the cervix that may be early changes for cervical cancer. And what they're able to do then is to biopsy or treat at that time, as opposed to having this waiting period where they may not find that woman again before she goes on to develop cervical cancer.
So it's a detection method.
It is a detection method. It's pretty good. We don't use it a lot in this country because we have better ways that people follow up a little bit better and have better means to get back to the doctor. But it is an effective strategy that's used in the developing world.
What's in the vinegar that makes cervical cancer perhaps show up? How's that work?
It helps to dry out the cells, and so you're able to see changes a little easier.
And is this being used all over the world in some third world countries, or are these just Americans that are doctors that are going to Africa and doing this?
It is being used kind of all over the world as a screening method. In the United States, what often happens is you do a pap smear. If that's abnormal, you get something called a colposcopy, which uses vinegar to detect those changes and do biopsies at that time.
Okay. What would you tell guys who have wives and girlfriends about cervical cancer and whether they should be the ones prodding their loved ones to go get checked?
And I would say to men that they are also candidates for the HPV vaccine. So it has been approved for boys as well as for girls, and they are.
And explain why that is.
The reason being is that HPV is communicated between the two, and so sexually transmitted. And although things like anal cancer, penile cancer, or pharyngeal cancer are much less common HPV-associated diseases than cervical cancer, they are still HPV-associated diseases, and they are susceptible to those. And so the HPV vaccine may benefit them as well.
But would you also tell them, I kind of interrupted you, would you also tell them, hey, tell your wife or girlfriend to go get checked?
Yes, tell your wife, girlfriend, get your children vaccinated, make sure they're keeping up with their pap smears and other things.
And any final notes to the women out there who are listening to this program about cervical cancer?
My final note would be that get screening when you're supposed to. And so it's really, as a provider who takes care of women with cancer, the greatest complaint that most people have is, I wish I would have gotten screening sooner. I wish I would have kept up with my doctor, or that I've seen a doctor a lot and maybe they just weren't aware that they weren't getting the screening they were supposed to have. So making sure that they're asking for that, be an advocate for yourself, and get vaccinated.
Very good. Dr. Erin Medlin from ULP and gynecologic oncology teacher at UofL School of Medicine. Appreciate you being on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. We always try and wrap up these programs with a Did You Know segment, a little trivia about the University of Louisville. So here's your Did You Know segment for today.
Oh, dear.
No, that's a good one. The University of Louisville School of Dentistry, which is right next door to you down there on the Health Sciences campus, the UofL School of Dentistry is ranked 13th in the nation in the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research funding for 2016. That's a jump from 17th in the previous year. The school received over $4 million during fiscal year 2016. So good job for School of Dentistry and doing some research.
Great.
That is great, isn't it? All right, you can hear U of L Today with Mark Hebert every Monday and Tuesday night after Ramsey and Rutherford, and on Saturday and Sunday mornings as well here on 93.9 The Ville. I'll have another TV story about something cool going on at U of L every Monday morning at 9:30 on Great Day Live, which is on WHAS TV with Rachel Platt and Terry Miner. So join me on Monday mornings around 9:30 or so. Thanks for listening to U of L Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.